Okay, so I'm joined here with a very, distinguished panel. So to my right, I have Dr. Mukhalika Banerjee, who's director of the London School of Economics South Asia Centre. She's the inaugural director of the the LSE South Asia, and is an associate professor in social anthropology there. To my left, I have Mihir Sharma, who is the India columnist for Bloomberg View. He's trained as an economist and a political scientist in both Delhi and Boston. I have Professor Sunil Khilnani, who's director of the India Institute at King's College. He's the Avanta professor and director of the India Institute there. And on the far left, I've got Rajendra Chand, who's a senior advisor at DTA Consulting, and he's got almost 50 years of commercial experience at all levels and ranging across a variety of industries from banking and finance to public affairs. So, I suppose then there's me. I'm a senior counsel here at Taylor Wessing. I've got an India-based practice that focuses on life sciences. So, does anybody have any questions for our panel? You're the first there, sir.
Just a couple of questions. Most of them.
Wait, sorry.
I'm just interested in sort of finding out what people's views are on the two notions which sort of slightly bother me. Be interesting to have a response. One is that people think that rural India needs to be vacated because rural India needs to be vacated in terms of people leaving it because the agriculture is so it's not sustainable economically. And the second notion is if you take people out of rural India and you put them into current Indian cities, and that is seen also as a workable solution. Are those two assumptions defendable in any sort of way?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll take this question. Can you hear me? Do I need to? Yeah. I spend all my research is located in rural India, so I'll try and attempt your question. I think about rural India as well. So India, as you know, is a rapidly urbanizing country, and it's an alarming rate of urbanization. And the drivers of urbanization are really, as you say, one of the reasons is the lack of sustainability in agriculture. Agriculture is simply not a sustainable livelihood, but a lack of investment in industry in rural India. I don't think there is a conscious desire that to vacate rural India. It's frankly way too vast but it's true that rural India doesn't feature as it should in a national conversation about policy as much as it should. So one good example of this is, of course, the fact that there's been an absolutely devastating drought across 5 states in India over the last 12 months. And very, very little has been written and discussed in the national media about this. It's absolutely shocking that it is happening in the same states where other much more trivial incidents. The only time it made the national news was when, you remember, somebody put in a PIL about watering the cricket pitches during IPL, right? And how can you use the water for cricket pitches? So when it becomes a cricket issue and an IPL issue, it made the national news. But at least for a couple of days, there was a discussion about it. But the fact that there was a real crisis, and there continues to be a crisis, the Supreme Court has asked 5 states to enact their own policy on drought. Not anything new. They have handbooks telling them what they need to do if there is a drought situation. These state governments haven't. The Supreme Court said they had to. That was in May. Nothing has been done. And there are absolutely there's no oversight of this from either the central or the state governments. Now, I think it's symptomatic of where rural India features in. That's one thing. The second thing to say, I think, is that a lot of the migration within India is circular between urban and rural. So even people who move to urban areas, there are a number of push factors rather than push and pull factors. But they also need to return to rural, to bring in the harvest or to hold all rituals or to vote. A lot of people don't register as urban voters. They go back to vote in rural areas and so on. Now, the circularity of this migration is creating completely new ways of thinking, aspirations, pressures in rural India, as much as it is on urban India. And we're simply not paying enough attention to those. But there's new, even in academic research, rural India used to be studied by social scientists across the world a lot more until about 30 years ago. At the moment, the body of research at any level within academia and outside of it on rural India is really quite poor. But I think this issue of migration, I know a couple of colleagues who are just starting to work on them, and to look at urban poor. Often you see, of course, they are construction labor, is a classic one. Ununionized, most disenfranchised, lot of them, are people who are coming from rural India. So there are ways in which this work is happening.
Would anybody else like to?
No, I completely agree with what you're saying. We see it on the ground level. There is a movement back to the rural areas, particularly from areas like Bihar, etc. We are seeing that because labor is not always available, for construction jobs, etc. The drought situation has been more than 12 months. It's now 24 months almost in most parts of India. So we have had this situation. Fortunately, the monsoon has hit, and in some areas it's hit pretty big time. But a lot more will be done, and I think that's also some of the schemes like Skills India, etc., were meant for doing this, for upgrading the skills that would be available in the rural areas. But data is available. There is a lot more happening. Agriculture is just not profitable at all, period. So all we're doing is losing money in that, and now we have to find a fix for that. The people are thinking about, why don't we lease land in Africa and grow our fodder there and grow our, crops which require water in Africa and bring that back here. So people are beginning to start looking at some pretty hairy ideas, but they're all out there. And as far as agriculture is concerned, I think there is some data now showing right up to 2050 that this is going to be a losing proposition.
Well, I think I absolutely agree with what has been said before. Let me just nuance a couple of things. The first is that while the national media hasn't covered the drought in the way that it should have, regional media has done a little bit better. But what is really interesting is that it tells you sometimes how good it is to live in a democratic country. Because the government, the central government in particular, has responded much quicker than the urban elite and the media has. So, the local guys will tell their MPs, and the MPs will tell, the party chief or the prime minister. And the last budget that was presented was sold completely as a changing the face of agriculture, drought reduction, helping the farmer kind of budget, which was not, I think, something that could have been predicted 2 years ago when this government took office. And it is in response to developing circumstances. So that's one. I'm not entering into how well it may work. I'm just saying that this is a signifier of at least the government is responding. The second point is on the question of can we vacate rural India? Well, I don't think that's the right way to put it. The right way to put it is it the case that what we now see as rural India will continue to be rural with people living rural lives and rural occupations and with rural forms of social organization forever? And that is the question that I think we should be asking. And I think that here the by and large, most politicians, policymakers, and whatnot have been left behind by how people themselves view it. When I go to a small town or a large village, and sometimes these are becoming indiscernible now, especially near the highways. Frequently, you speak to people who say, yes, of course they're attached to where they're from. And then you try and drill down into why they're attached to it, why they don't want to lose touch with it, and they will say, the comfort of it. All right, and so what is the comfort of it? I have a house here, I have to share things, I have to share space in a city. What else? I have to stay here because if I lose my contact to the village, then I lose all power. I will, through my franchise and through the existing networks here of providing social insurance, getting access to political patronage, that's how I and my family can ensure that we survive the hard times. So to the extent that we have a welfare state in India, which is not a very great extent, but at least some of it exists, it is tied to location. If I move permanently, chasing a ladder of prosperity somewhere in the city, I am giving up on whatever the state has put into place to make sure that I don't fall down and fall off that ladder. And we have not responded to the possibility that people might want to move by helping our welfare state also move with them. All right, so part of the reason why people go back and forth and why you have to go back to vote, for example, is that if you lose your access in your native place, as we say, you are losing complete access to everything that the state can do for you. And that has to change. And that has to change because people have to be given a choice, in some sense, of where they want to live their lives and where they think they can become prosperous. Currently, we're truncating that choice, and that's a bad idea. And the second part of your question, which was, can we just move them to our current cities? Well, most of our current cities aren't planned for their current population, right? And so they're crowded, they're unpleasant. I mean, there are a couple of fun examples that I always trot out whenever. Howrah Station, which in Calcutta, the city I grew up in, has, I think, now 17 platforms. And it was designed for 14, for about, I think, 4,000 passengers a day. And I think it must have at least 100 and some times that now. Right.
1,000 an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's an absurd degree to which we have crowded the infrastructure that exists. We have not expanded that infrastructure within our existing cities. And one of the amazing things is, and there are people who've done sort of interviews with people, with urban planners within the government and with city politicians who are asked, when they're asked why haven't you done this, he said, more people will come. So, the thing is that if you make a city comfortable and attractive, then it turns out people will arrive, and that's a horrific thought. Okay, so you're caught in this kind of catch-22 situation where you have to be able to create the infrastructure, but in order to allow people to come, the politicians don't, and policymakers, and frankly, even the urban middle class in India doesn't want to do that, because we like the idea that we live in our, in the cities exactly in the pristine way the British left them, all right, with nice little gardens and 3-story houses. And it is technically illegal in the city of Bombay, which is one of the most crowded places in the world, with real estate that's among the, depending on how you count it, in the 5 or 20 most expensive real estate in the world, patches of real estate in the world. It is technically illegal to build more than 2 stories in the greater Bombay area. Every single exception to that has to be specifically pushed through with very, very specific licenses, but it's illegal to build more than 2 stories. Now, I want you to imagine how, and the moment you try and change that, you'll have a crew of people coming and saying, no, because then, it gets dense and more people will come, and, that's a terrible thing. The people are already there, it's just they're on the pavements. So, I mean, these are the questions that, there's a lot of, very backwards thinking that has to be dealt with first before we can fix urbanization.
Okay, I'll be quick. Again, I think all of what's been said is exactly right. I guess I would just make a couple of more general points. I mean, one, India is a historical point. India is the last of the great large-scale agrarian societies to be making this shift from agriculture to industry. So after Britain, Germany, France, Russia, China, all of these societies who have been making this transition have made it. India is the last of those. So how it manages this transition is one of the really deep challenges that India faces politically. It's also the only society on that scale that is trying to manage this democratically, because Russia and China did this through revolution, and they did it through the centralization of power and through basically land reform, which managed to increase their agricultural productivity and controlled the extent and pace of shift from rural to urban. So there was a much more controlled shift. India is the only society of that scale, Russia and China, which is trying to manage it democratically. So it's a massively difficult challenge. And there are two aspects to that challenge that I emphasize. One is, how do you increase rural agrarian productivity? Because that's, I think, underlying a lot of this question, that the agricultural sector in India has not been a productive one. It's not been, and linked to that is, how do you generate the employment that is needed to soak up the agrarian population, really? And those, and that's not simply going to happen through a kind of vacation of the countryside and a filling of the city. You have to create the jobs somewhere. And so the effort to make the agrarian economy more productive and therefore to also generate more employment, I think are challenges that India is going to face. And just to give you an example, I mean, even in those parts of India which have been agriculturally very successful, and that's happened through what's known as the Green Revolution, essentially through technical inputs, through irrigation and fertilizers and others which the state has subsidized. Those are turning out not to be very sustainable models in two ways. I mean, one, environmentally, they're not very sustainable. So the drilling of deep wells to irrigate and so on is showing itself as being a disaster. And secondly, in parts of, for example, Haryana, which has been at the forefront of the Green Revolution, the younger generation are not actually working the land anymore. But nor have they got the education to give them employment. So you're now having the emergence amongst the upper castes of some of these most prosperous parts of the countryside where the Green Revolution has worked, some of the upper castes who are asking for affirmative action in the form of reservations, who are asking to be classified as eligible for that. So there are many, many twists to this story of the agrarian to urban and industrial move. But and you're right to raise it early on, and I agree with what's been said. But one needs to see it in that bigger perspective, I think, as well.
So I've got a quick follow-on question in relation to this. But we've talked about the Indian cities being too crowded as they are, and infrastructure in the existing cities being difficult to improve on because you'll just encourage further crowding. And I think this follows on from what you've just said, Sunil. I mean, is there any appetite in India to build new cities from scratch in India, like China has done?
100 smart cities.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the thing of the 100 smart cities idea is basically, I'll take an existing municipality or city, and James in the audience can probably hold forth on this for like 5 hours, but and take a particular set of projects and award them to an area and let that happen, and see how. So maybe a city suddenly becomes smart if it has like a little microchip controlling its buses. All right, and that's wonderful, but it's not quite what we're talking about. There are a couple of projects that are ongoing. The southern state of Andhra Pradesh is building a capital called Amravati. Yep. The state of Chhattisgarh, which was what is interesting here is that it tells you exactly how the Indian state operates. Both the southern state of Andhra Pradesh and the state of Chhattisgarh, which is also building a capital called New Raipur, basically were farmed off from existing states and lost their capitals. So the moment you have a bunch of bureaucrats sitting somewhere who discover they don't have big enough offices anymore, then suddenly the thought of building a city arises. So that's the, the sort of motivation. And they're thinking, I mean, Amravati, I don't know how well it'll turn out. There are questions around land acquisition, but, Cisco has got a giant contract to try and help plan it. I was last month in a southern Chinese town called Guiyang, which has spent a lot of money building itself up. It's extremely remote, and now they don't know what to do with themselves because it's poured so much, and they have an enormous provincial debt, and they're hoping to make a lot of that debt go down by essentially selling their know-how in building a city to Chandrababu Naidu, who was the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh and building this city. So there are a couple of these state-level projects going on, but there is nothing sustained. The one hope that I do have is that as part of an existing project that is being funded by the Japanese overseas, JDIC, whatever it's called, Japanese Development something Corporation, from Delhi to Bombay, which is called the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. That was supposed to include within it a certain number, maybe I can't forget, maybe 20 or 25 manufacturing zones, which were in fact going to be almost independent cities with their own leadership and have, housing area for workers, have built-in urban facilities, etc., etc., etc. The DMIC is supposed to be completed in the next year and a half, and 2 or 3 of these cities are actually being built right now. That is relatively underreported for one very good reason, which is that Narendra Modi did not think of it or take any hand in it. So we're not listening to it being talked about right now, but it's something that I do hope will develop into something in a while.
I think we've probably spoken about that enough. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Can I request the panel to maybe just look at if the question is that when you talk about one positive thing about India and one thing that India can do better, what would those things be? And the other is from Prime Minister Modi's perspective, if I ask you his 2 years report card and one thing that he has done right and one thing he could have done better, what that could be? Thank you.
You want me to take it?
Yes, please. Yes.
Look, I'm not a journalist. I'm not political. I come from a practitioner's point of view. I see the transactions on the ground. I see what's in the pipeline. I see what's of interest and what's happening, irrespective of the color of the flag. We've seen it for 3 decades. Everybody's gone through some, machination of some kind. There is a method in our madness. Unfortunately or fortunately, we have a bureaucracy that we have inherited over several centuries, and the bureaucracy continues. So at the end of the day, it must be understood that it's not just Narendra Modi's job. Narendra Modi does not necessarily, approve a transaction. The transaction starts from bottom up. India is a very bottom-up country. Secretaries of the government do not necessarily make decisions. Generally, the joint secretary is the most important person. So there is a way in which these people conduct their business. There's a way in which they look at transactions. There are checks and balances, and I think Mayor said it very rightly that, you see, you have inherited something you have to make good now. Now, where do we go from here? The one good thing that we've been able to do, to answer your question, is on the ease of doing business. And we see that. We see that on the ground. We see that as being invited even to a panel for the upper house, where we gave suggestions on what could be done. We see it in feedback that we are getting from clients, very large, reputable global corporations on the ground. We see it from interest today in not just the Japanese who are looking at putting long-term money because they've got negative interest rates in their own country, but what we're seeing right now and what I've seen in action and transactions happen are the Canadian pension funds coming in. Now those things never happened before. So as somebody said earlier in the day, India is trying to make itself more attractive from an investment point of view. And obviously these people are doing their arithmetic. And there is something happening. 4 roads have just been bought by the Canadian pension funds from a Spanish company. And the Spanish company had got it from one of these build, operate, transport type of contractors who got it because of his political connections. But today they're having to actually make it work. So there is interest and there are deals in the pipeline. We haven't seen those numbers come out as yet. They're not always reported because these are proprietary in nature, but there is a lot happening on the ground. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best, but at least we're getting there. But it's a difficult process. You have to understand, India is a complicated country. It is not who you know, it is how the system works, how the paper flows. And that's why it becomes so important to be patient as hell. That's a fact. So all the big boys have gone through this, and yet we have glowing examples of groups like Unilevers and others who've been able to live there, without any hassles. So it cuts both ways. But the report card will be in terms of, interest on the ground and transactions on the ground. And we're seeing that.
Raise my hand. Oh, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well. I mean, I'll stick to the political aspect. I mean, I think one thing that's positive about India and on which it could do better is democracy, in both respects. I think it's a positive aspect, and of course, it could be doing it much better. And I'll just two brief examples. I mean, one, I think the way in which India is able to eject its leaders, the way it conducts elections, is a remarkable success story and a remarkably positive aspect of Indian politics. I think the way in which elected leaders and assemblies and parliaments govern once they are in power is terrible. And I think that's not a very good reflection of the nature of Indian democracy. So I think on the accountability front, on how to make governments and leaders accountable beyond just the sporadic once-in-5-year events, I think that's where there's a lot more that could be done. On the Modi report card, I mean, I'm sure you've been discussing details of this all through the day, so I'll just keep it general. I mean, I think, one thing that he did bring, and there's still a substantial amount of it, is a kind of an optimism and a hope. And I think psychological moods are very important, not just for markets, but also for polities. I think he did bring that, it's still there. But I think that is also now being checked by, for many Indians today, a sense of fear as well. Fear because of the religious beliefs you might hold, fear because of the way you might eat, fear because of some of the ideas and thoughts you might hold. So I think that would be the negative I would put on the report card, and I'll keep it at that general level.
Makalika.
Oh, okay, I thought you were going down.
Oh no, I thought I'd mix it up a bit.
I was going to talk about democracy, but maybe the short answer is to just say cricket. And we played well. I think we should play more Test cricket and less T20. I think 2020 should be banned, to be honest. That's a personal opinion. We can talk about it. But seriously, I mean, that is a serious answer, short, serious answer. But if I can then just elaborate on what Sunil said, a lot of my research in the last 7 or 8 years has been exploring why India's voter turnout rates go up in every election. It's extraordinary. And if you live in Britain studying this, it's the worry about voter apathy that you see across the Western world and older democracies compared to this enthusiasm that there is for elections. And what the research shows is that people are in fact very clear-eyed about how venal politicians can be. So this trust deficit and what Sunil was saying about how appallingly they perform once they're in power, the high rates of criminal records, more than a third of elected representatives having a criminal record, etc. People see this, and yet the reason why they engage is because they're able to see their role as citizens. The fact that they need to participate, they're quite proud of the fact that they live in a country where they can choose their leaders. And it's very fragile to my mind. So this is a good thing, but that hope and that trust and that ability to participate as citizens, not thinking only of self-interest, of thinking of a sort of larger society's good, we cannot bank on it. And that's a worry, that's a negative aspect of it. In terms of a concrete thing that can be made better, I think, yes, our elections are extraordinary. The feat of conducting these, 815 million is the size of the electorate in India. 8 million election polling officials conducted. And, this thing actually, India pulls nothing else off, but it pulls this off. But the one area of reform, and there are two areas of reform, I'd say. One is campaign expenditure. I think we really ought to look at this very, very seriously. And there are ways in which, and there are, individuals have to declare how much they do, but there's a loophole in the law, and political parties don't need to declare. And it's something that I think we need to address to get at least our record in elections right. There is a democratic deficit in between elections, yes, but even in the electoral system. And the second thing is, there are 3 tiers of government, and we were talking about rural India earlier. Panchayat elections, which happen at the village level, we've just come to the end of a 4-year study looking at panchayat elections, all panchayat elections that happened in the last 4 years. We've studied them very closely. And you realize this extraordinary electoral performance that you get at the national and the state assembly elections. We've just had 5 in India recently, the state ones, which are so well run. The panchayat elections is a completely different ballgame. The election commission is not in charge. There's no transparency. There is still ballot papers. It's not as, it's nowhere near good an electoral machinery that you have for the national and the more visible levels of election. And this needs serious reform.
Do you feel basic level of education, that's been a topic that's been discussed about at panchayati level elections, that candidates have to have at least basic graduation to be able to
Well, we did a study, actually, it's interesting, in Haryana, where, this was imposed in the assembly elections, where it wasn't just, it was education and whether you had a toilet in your house. These were meant to incentivize a certain kind of candidate. I think our assumption was that, and I think that was borne out, that it immediately disenfranchises a whole section of rural poor people who don't have access to education, who don't have toilets, certainly not when the elections were held. And therefore, the poor are not allowed to represent themselves, which was the one good thing, that you had at least the possibility of that in the democratic process, which often was difficult because of the kind of money that was involved. But on the other hand, rather counterintuitively, the research showed that people quite welcomed it. And as a result of this, suddenly we had more women candidates standing in elections. Now, whether this can be borne out on a larger sample, I don't know. I think we need to probe it. But I think the jury is out on what implications that change in law would bring in.
Well, I was, of course, going to say democracy in elections is the one thing we do well, which just tells you exactly, either it tells you what a wonderful democracy we are, or how few other things there are. But let me then pick something else. Let's talk about as the one thing that India has done well and continues to do well, is to expand its ambitions as to what it should do for its people. All right, and it's very interesting to see in sequential general election cycles how much agreement there is between the parties as to what the state can and should be doing, and B, how much they have expanded their expectations of what that is. So 20 years ago, the parties would not have agreed on massively injecting funds into education. 10 years ago, into primary education. 10 years ago, they did. All right. Now we are in the last election, the parties agreed, the Congress and the BJP, that deregulation and the ease of doing business should be paramount. In the coming election cycle, it is going to be about access to health. All right, once again, things are being rolled out, and I'm not saying that this is done well, but what is important to recognize is that at each point, the Indian state looks around, sees that its people are not accessing certain things or are struggling to access certain things, and recognizes that it must provide that. Now, there are failures in how it provides that, but the ambition, nevertheless, has to be recognized, first. Second, what it has not done well, and it continues to do poorly, I think, is deal with the status of women. We've by and large left that to, things will get better. All right, education will come in, and people will start. That really isn't, neither in increasing income nor increasing education, as far as I know, has shown itself to be properly correlated with an increase in the status of women. I mean, a lot of it winds up on depending upon specific social structures in specific places. And the government has not, the central government or the state governments have not stepped in and tried to fight these social situations head on. The political barriers to addressing the status of women have just not been torn down. And that is something that I actually do not see moving, all right, to tell you the truth. And, so that is a major problem, and the implications of this are vast, both morally and economically. Okay, now, Prime Minister Modi, what has he done well? I think he has very intelligently focused attention on a couple of things where we really need to get moving as a nation. We need to start working on getting a manufacturing sector going again. We have been deindustrializing essentially since 1994, 1995, and that is, it's obviously way too early in our development process to be deindustrializing. So he has focused attention through his speeches and through his supposed campaigns on reversing that trend. That's a good thing. And similarly, he has focused attention on the fact that sanitation and, India is not a pleasant place to live because it is dirty and smelly. I think this is something that most of us who live in India agree. We don't like people pointing it out, but we accept it, right? And the Prime Minister has stood up, and made that an issue. Again, he may not have implemented it perfectly, but he has focused attention on this, and he's focused the government machinery on this. So these are two things he's done well. What he's done badly is that he has sat back and thought that his presence alone is sufficient to deliver what he wants to get done. And the truth is that what actually is needed to deliver all these things that he has promised and all the things that we expect of him is to fundamentally change the nature of the Indian state. It has to become more responsive, it has to become more flexible, it has to become more accountable. And it cannot do that with the structure it currently has. We essentially, what I always say is that we have inherited exactly what the British gave to us in terms of the state that runs this vast country. The British set up a minimal cost extractive state, all right? Something where you just, want to put two members of the Indian civil service in a giant tract of land and ensure that, they didn't spend much money in delivering anything to the people. There just weren't any riots and taxes were paid. All right? And we have pretty much ensured that continues to be the structure of the state in India. That has to change first before any of the other things that Mr. Modi plans or that we can talk about here get done. And Mr. Modi has shown no interest whatsoever in this, and that is his greatest failure, and that is why his prime ministership will fail by his own lights and by the lights of the people who elected him.
So I'd like to add that in respect of successes from India that I'm very aware of in my practices, advances in the life sciences and also in software and IT services. So there's clearly some very good education going on in India. And I just wondered, does the panel have any ideas as to, yes, life sciences and software, everybody knows about these particular strengths and successes of India. Does anybody have any ideas of other areas of future success for India and new areas of expertise?
I expect space research is going to be one.
Yeah.
Space research, as you start getting embedded in the global, dual-use technology system, then you begin to get access to technologies that you didn't have earlier. And we do have both, this sort of relatively low cost but high capability industrial and research sector, which we've had for a long time, and that might be able to produce a reasonable amount of cutting edge stuff. And I think that we should not sell our corporate and marketing expertise short at all. I think that that is something that the Indian private sector does really, really well. The management of our companies is, by the standards of the developing world, excellent. All right, and the way that we can pitch our products and sell them is, again, by the standards of the developing world, excellent. If you imagine that this is where rents are going to be extracted in the future, God knows what the future economy will look like, but that's possibly one place where they will. I think that as the developing world becomes more of a market economy and more of a consumer economy, India will be leading that. So, to whatever extent that is.
Makalika.
Okay, I'm a social scientist. I was trained in Indian universities, and who asked the question? You asked.
I asked the question.
You asked the
yeah.
question. And now have spent 25 years in British higher education, and it is, as a social scientist, it's and this may be slightly distant from your world, but a lot of the research, not just economists, but and economists probably don't count themselves as social scientists anyway. But a lot of the sociology, the thinking about the Indian population, whether it's political philosophy, whether it's anthropology, whether it's history, things that really talk about Indian society over in a critical fashion, evidence-based, analytical, which in many ways is unlike space research or unlike marketing, is more likely to be critical of political regimes, simply by virtue of producing an analysis on the basis of evidence rather than taking a political position necessarily. Now, India has very, very high quality social scientists. The academic diaspora across the world, the United States, there have been big movements of history, for instance, that really took over history writing in all parts of the world that came out of Indian historians, which critiqued elitist history writing, subaltern history, and lots of other kinds of philosophical writings, historical writings, sociological writings, where Indian academics, homegrown from Indian universities, have done extremely well internationally. Unfortunately, and this is, talking about, there has been a huge underinvestment across regimes in public universities in India. And I think this is part of a larger underinvestment in public institutions more generally. There is institutional deficit is really quite dire. And we can talk about institutions in other sectors too, but certainly in higher education, where India did have the lead in many ways, certainly in social science, has been very bad. In the previous regime, Delhi University, one of the biggest universities, was really interfered with by the regime of turning a 3-year degree into a 4-year degree. This made the headlines, and there was there was an agenda there that was forced on academics. And recently, in this regime, we've had, it's in a funny way, it reminds me of what the Brexiters were saying about experts, and this, we don't need to listen to these guys because they just come up with all this stuff that makes us think otherwise. Or the fact, a lack of understanding of what a university is for, and so many people in this room I can see, but know what that world is, where a university is a place for critique, for creating, for airing, of trying out different points of view, of so on, of being a crucible of ideas, which is not likely to please all political regimes, but it's been a real issue in the last 2 years in India, that space for intellectual critique of systems, of governance, of political parties, but also of ideas of nationalism and so on, has simply shrunk. That's a real worry, because somewhere I think the self-confidence of India on the global stage has been because of its intellectual capital, its historical capital, which is not chauvinistic. It doesn't need to be chauvinistic because there is a 5,000-year-old history there, but it's backed by evidence rather than claims of its historical heritage.
Sorry, Sunil, I think you wanted to answer that question as well.
Okay, just very briefly. I mean, if we're talking about areas where I think there might be interesting new developments or new skills emerging. Again, talking about small pockets, but I think certainly from some of the best of India's law schools, there's a very fine stream of excellent legal minds emerging, and I think that's actually very important for India, both for India's politics, India's constitutional politics, but also for its ability to be a big commercial nation. You need legal expertise to work on that. And the other area, I think, and it's linked to something that Mihir said, is, I think, in what one would call broadly the creative industries, design, marketing, film, and I think it's a product of a kind, and even the kind of arts more generally, actually. The sort of cultural domains. It's a product of being an open society now for 70 years, and I think you're beginning to see now as the economy starts to give the wherewithal for some of that creative expression. You're starting, and I think you'll continue to see some very rich contributions from young Indian creative minds.
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Actually, I was going through some of the consultants' reports over the period of over a decade. So, for example, Goldman Sachs in around 2003-2004, they coined the terms BRICS, and they predicted basically India about a big potential. Somewhere around 2014, after 10 years, they realized that they are making 0.25% of their profit margins from India. So somehow they started putting the caution about the Indian market. Of course, they changed it again after Mr. Modi. Same thing basically goes in retail sector. Around 2000, eminent retail consultant like KSA, Technopark and all in India, they were talking basically about the organized retail sector goldmine in India. And same way basically go for aviation sector. I was saying around 2003, 2004, KPMG, Kawa, they were predicting a great, goldmine in Indian aviation sector. Could you please, eminent panelists, name a single company in the organized retail sector which is profitable in Indian market after 10-15 years? A single company in aviation sector which is actually making a profit? Or is it everything basically sold in the future, post-dated check, which may not exist? Because even if you see the hallmark success of Indian IT sectors, all the Indian IT sectors companies make hardly 2 or 3% of their profit margin from Indian market, rest 95-97% basically from abroad, from Western market. So is it Indian business model is profitable at all for the Western organization because of their huge costs involved in following different policies or different procedures? That's my question.
I think you're asking
Yes.
I think you're asking the wrong question. The question is, why are KPMG and Goldman Sachs still profitable if they screwed up so massively? They made that prediction.
So 0.25%.
They made that prediction when Jim O'Neill stood up and said that BRICS exists. All right, and this is where the future of my bank's profits are going to come from. He should be held accountable for getting it so wrong. All right, when KPMG sits down and says in 2004, looking at absurdly inflated numbers for the number of people who are likely to start flying over the next 10-15 years in India, that the civil aviation sector is going to be a gold mine. KPMG should be held responsible. You're asking the wrong question.
Okay, sir, let me very simple. Point is, I'm just asking a very specific question. Is there a single company in the retail sector, organized retail sector, which is making profit? Or single company in a e-commerce side, which is actually making a profit in India, in retail sector? And single company in the aviation side, which is actually making a profit? I'm just asking that.
When you expect that your future revenues will grow so massively, and when you expect that you will have such a vast increase in your customer base over the next 10-15 years, you are unlikely to see profitable companies in your sector. Why? Because everyone will lever up massively in debt and expect that sometime in the future, you'll start making a profit. The reason that you're not seeing profitable companies in these sectors, which are supposed to grow so much, is precisely because people like KPMG came in the mid-2000s and said, these are sectors that are going to grow. They managed to go out onto the market, borrow money massively, now have a debt overhang, expand it stupidly without thinking about where they were going, without thinking about profits. So again, your question as to why these chaps are not profitable right now is very closely linked to the expectations that were falsely built up in the mid-2000s.
Let me add to what Mir said. You said it very accurately. He's only talked about reports that you have mentioned. Let me tell you, all those transactions have been structured by them. I'm talking about the big four and all the others, and everybody knows this. The disaster in e-commerce has happened simply because of them. The Walmarts of the world, all of them have suffered because of this. Your question on profitability, the model for the current world in e-commerce works on valuations. It doesn't work on profitability per se, the way we knew it. The bricks and mortar days are over. The debate we are having in India today is between the bricks and mortar people and the e-commerce people. So the e-commerce people came up with a new design called a marketplace model, if you remember, where they were able to get around the regulation. Now that has come to stay. And yet if you go and see the structure, the accounting structure that works, who bills you, which invoices come, you will see the structure is given by the big four. And they've created all the mess over there. That's now being unbundled.
Yes, please, James.
So, a simple question and then a bonus. Will the BJP win a majority of the seats in the lower house in 2019? And as a bonus, who, if you had to bet, will be the next Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh?
I'm going to take it as seriously as the question is posed. I think it will win a majority. And the reason being, I presume you want a reason, not just an answer, because the only likely opposition is going to come from an alliance of Nitish, Mamata, Jayalalitha, Patnaik, none of whom, with perhaps the exception of Nitish Kumar, have national ambitions. None of them want to be Prime Minister. Jayalalitha doesn't want to be Prime Minister. Mamata Banerjee doesn't want to be Prime Minister. They have huge electoral capital, but they don't have the political ambition. Neither do they have the personality. Kejriwal is another. All of them, in funny ways, dispassionately looking at them, they're all actually rather similar, and perhaps not that dissimilar to our Prime Minister himself, where there is a certain character trait of centralization of power, of slight paranoia, of distrust of people around you, not really being team players. All of them are the same. So I can't see a coalition coming out of it's like herding cats. So, which is why I think there won't be an effective opposition and the BJP will win. Your bonus question, let me think about it a little more. You clearly don't want to hear Akhilesh Yadav, so you want a more creative answer than that, and I can think about it.
I think I tend to agree. I think 2019 will again be a Modi affair. The margins may not be as high as what we saw before, but there'll be enough. I think the whole move towards a federal concept and the fact, hopefully, that GST comes in, etc., there's going to be a bit of sharing of wealth that's going to happen. And the states are more interested in what they're doing themselves. And Andhra Pradesh is one that's competing with Telangana. Telangana is apparently, from what I'm told on the ground, from people who are doing transactions there, is working very well. And there is a move now for a lot of things that will happen in these two southern states. As far as UP is concerned, it's a touch and go situation. I am not so sure that BJP will win UP. I personally don't believe it. I still think that Akhilesh will win the seat. That's my belief. He has pulled up his socks and he is doing a much better job now.
So, Anything to
Well,
add?
I'll just have that. I mean, I'm touched that you still have some faith in the wisdom of punditry, or perhaps you're being very ironic about it. I mean, on UP, I have no special wisdom or thoughts on. I mean, on 2019 elections, I'm a great believer in the surprise of democracy and democratic processes, and I think there's plenty of evidence on which I can rest that belief. So, it's quite possible that another opposition figure may emerge in the next 2.5 years. We don't quite know, what. I think if events produce leaders, they emerge out of circumstances. The 2004 election in India was not predicted as it went. Narendra Modi emerged as a national leader in a pretty meteoric way in about a year before the 2014 election. So I don't think it's a done and dusted deal that the BJP will be back in with a comfortable majority in 2019. There's quite a bit to play for yet, and there may be surprises along the way.
May I add a small footnote, which is that historical evidence shows that no party that came in on a wave has won the subsequent election. So they'd be bucking the trend if they did.
Okay, 2019, my expectation is that they'll come back. The reason is because if you drill down into how they won 2014, it appears that you have a sizable now swing vote across the north of, let's say, 18 to 30 young men, middle and upper caste, all right, who are willing to switch loyalties. It appears, now you have to get into sort of the realm of emotion, as it were. My suspicion is that these chaps have, as a generation, hitched their star to, Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi's star. And it's just one of those things. I mean, he may disappoint them, but when it comes to 2019, they're just going to go back and vote for him again, and God knows for how long. The example I would give is that in 2012, you could wander the coasts of America and not find a single satisfied Obama voter. All right, all that entire bunch of idiots who went in, claiming that he would change the country in 2008, all were, by 2012 came around, older and wiser, and recognized that he wasn't going to change much, but they all voted for him again. All right, and there is an emotional connection with the people who are politicized in a particular way that some leaders have, and I think Narendra Modi has that connection, and we would be foolish to disregard it. So it would take a real opposition alliance and a true upsurge to unseat him because of that connection. One. In Uttar Pradesh, it's a four-way election. These are anywhere notoriously hard to predict. All right, in Uttar Pradesh, triply so because it's Uttar Pradesh, and any number of swing votes, regional disparities, little things, etc., etc. My expectation is, however, that the next chief minister will be Mayawati, and the reason is because she can, when it comes down to it, if I had to put money on anyone, my money would be in her, because she can, when it comes down to it, take support from both the national parties and become chief minister. So the BSP can, as a Dalit party, take support from both the Congress and the BJP. The Samajwadi Party cannot take support from the BJP. It can only be supported by the Congress. So there's a slightly higher probability that in the case of close run race, it's Mayawati, but that's the most you can say. And that's, before you know how things are going to play out.
So I think we're sort of coming towards the end of our time, but Rakesh, I think you had one last question.
Maybe a very quick final question for me then. Where does Modi see India's place in the new world order? Has he got a grand plan?
Well, I mean, he's certainly determined to establish India as to use the phrase that has become current in India, as a leading power rather than a balancing power. This is a phrase that his foreign secretary has introduced into the discourse. And he's certainly been, as you all know, very active in trying to build relations, particularly, I think, with a focus in two directions. One is Asia, and the other is the US. Those have really been the great where he's devoted most of his energy. He started out with the immediate neighborhood, but that sort of petered out a bit. But he really has focused on Asia and the US. And I think does he have a grand plan? Well, I'm less clear about that. I don't see that emerging at all. I see a kind of almost hyperactivism, a desire to establish better relations, and particularly I think he and the party and movement that he comes from have always been very focused on and concerned by China. And I think that's something that he is also thinking about. As Chief Minister of Gujarat, of course, he invited a lot of Chinese investment into Gujarat, but I think he now also understands it as more of a strategic and security threat as well as an economic partner. So more is being invested in that direction. So I would say that he in many ways he's taken forward a momentum that was already underway in Indian foreign policy and placing itself in the world. He's accelerated it. But I think the turn towards Asia, the turn towards the US had already begun even a decade ago under previous governments, if not even earlier. So he's accelerated that, but I wouldn't say it's yet expressible or articulated in or has coalesced into a grand vision. I think it's very hard to have those grand visions. I think India has always been somewhat criticized for not having it, but sometimes there's also advantages in not explicitly articulating exactly what you do.
Mukhalika, anything to add on this?
Just to refer to last night's interview that he gave on Times Now, a very long and detailed interview, the first one that he's given since he was elected, and to a private news channel. It's unprecedented. And he does talk about foreign policy a lot, and I was struck, and of course, as what's already been said stands. And I was also very struck by how important it was for him to make sure that India was at every table that counted, and there was this sense of, I don't know whether it's a sort of assertiveness, which comes from a lack of self-confidence, somehow that India wasn't being taken seriously enough, and that now it was going to be taken seriously everywhere. And I think the recent NSG membership was part of that. But the fact that it requires all kinds of other coalitions and a lot of hard work behind the scenes was that it was being left out. But it was interesting that he placed so much emphasis in that interview on him doing the negotiation, and how important it was to form these personal bonds with the Chinese premier, personal bond with world leaders. And this was, and he says this very clearly, he says this just simply was missing from India's diplomacy in the past, which I thought was revealing and worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think the interview that you referred to, he laid out basically his grand plan. He even spoke of the Pacific Islands, where he got all these small islands like Vanuatu and Samoa and all together, basically because of one of the biggest challenges we are going to have, whether we like it or not, is the balancing of the ecology with the economy. This growth and that ecology, this debate is going to continue, and this is his biggest challenge. He is finding it difficult to manage these two things, these aspects. He wants to include everybody. He wants to make sure that India is counted at every table. But how are you going to do all of this, sitting in India alone? You can't. So it's not an easy game. But as you say, he's playing the ball right now.
So very quickly, Mr. Modi's worldview is that of his voters, and this is why there's a connection. And what do they expect? Mr. Modi expects that India in the future will be strong, Hindu, and rich, and those three things are the same thing. You know, if you're strong, then you're Hindu. If you're Hindu, then you're strong. If you're strong, then you're rich. If you're rich, then you're strong. If you're Hindu, then you're rich. If you're rich, then you're Hindu. All right. This is an entire complex of ideas. You can't disentangle them as, you know, people are very fond of doing. No, you know, he's actually a development person. No, he's a national security person. Nonsense. It's all three are the same thing. All right. They're mixed up in his head. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what does the paramount leader of China sitting right now in the Forbidden City imagine for China in the future? And if you think that Mr. Modi's ambition for India is less than that, you're wrong. All right, for every country thinks it's the center of the world. There are some countries that, maybe because of size or fortune, can actually aspire to that. Mr. Modi thinks that India, because of its heritage, because of its civilization, because of its history, because of, you know, everything, is something that in fact should be aspired to be the center of the world. Just as much as the paramount leader of China expects that China should be the center of the world, and as much as the President of the United States thinks and knows that Washington, D.C. is the center of the world. So that's, you know, if you actually want to know what they think, this is it comes from having a worldview that is not cosmopolitan or globalized, but it's very, very focused on a particular narrative of who you are from and where you are from and what your history is, right? A. B, he doesn't do plans. So this is his vision, but he doesn't do plans, he does PowerPoint, right? There is no way that he has a sense of how to achieve this. But he knows the behavior that he thinks should be associated with it. And for this, that's, you know, part of what, you know, the aggressiveness that is being talked about. There's an additional reason for this. If you speak to Mr. Modi's most passionate followers, they will tell you that in the 70 years that we have run this country has been run by women. We say, what? Because that really is not the case, right? I mean, this is not a female country in which women have much power. They say, no, you know, Nehru, such a feminized man, all right. Then Indira Gandhi, a woman, all right. Manmohan Singh didn't count, Sonia Gandhi, all right. So it's just run by women throughout. For the first time, you have a man. All right, and a man will actually show you how to behave on the world stage. You know, we've been retreating, you know, giving everyone space, this, that, and the other. No more of that. So everything that you've expected of India so far, soft, gentle, polite, considerate, all these things, feminine. But now we have a man.
Well, on that note, I think I'll call it an end now, but thank you very much to my panel.